I'm Tom Burgis. I'm the investigations correspondent with the FT, one of a small team. I used to be the correspondent in Johannesburg, and then covering Southern Africa, and then in Lagos covering West Africa, and then I came back to London onto this investigations desk, and I've written a book, which I believe is on sale, and which has very thick footnotes, which I hope are useful for conferences exactly like this, threads for people to pick up on. The number of footnotes means it's ideal to buy 2 copies of the book, so that you can keep the footnotes open as you consult the text. There are also photo sections if you wanted to have 3, just to compare as you go along. I wanted to talk about a couple of the stories that we've done, the big Africa corruption stories that have run in the FT, and also form big chunks of the book. A bit about the background of how we dug into them and how the various layers of reporting intersect with each other, and just some of the more extraordinary things we came across. But please interrupt or chip in at any stage from now onwards if there's a particular thing you want to explore, if anybody wants to know more about the reporting or more about the story itself or whatever it may be. There's no grand PowerPoint, it's just a few pictures as we go. When I was living in Nigeria in 2010, does anyone know Nigeria? Anyone been? Anyone want to go? When I was living in Nigeria in early 2010, there was a sort of political crisis. One president was sick and the other one was dithering about taking over. And I was traveling around the north, which is the sort of mainly Islamic area, since largely annexed by Boko Haram. And I got a call to say that something terrible had happened around this city called Jos, which is bang in the middle of Nigeria, between the Islamic north and the Christian south, in what's called the Middle Belt. And we got there, we drove through a great many roadblocks from a northern city down to get here. And as soon as we arrived, it was apparent that another one of these spasms of violence that you get in central Nigeria periodically had happened. There was a shoot-on-site curfew in place, so for the first day we were stuck in the city, and then the next morning we could get out to this place, which is called Kurukarama. And this is one of the few pictures from that day that I could possibly show. It was a hellish scene that day. About 150 people were killed by a kind of ad hoc militia that had come down out of the hills. And there were bodies all over this village, which was pretty much comprehensively burnt, as you can see. And a lot of people, well, not a lot of people actually, very few people actually got there, but a lot of the coverage of events like this in central Nigeria or in eastern Congo or the other big conflict zones are often written about, I think, by outsiders in a very superficial way, and often with sort of underlying casual racism, as though there's somehow a kind of primitive ethnic tribal hatreds bubble over. And there are ethnic tribal hatreds, for sure. But if you hang around, as I did for a few days, and as others have done, in places like Kurukarama and Jos, you see that when we write about ethnic rivalries, we miss the fact that rivalries are, of course, always over something. And in the case of Nigeria, and specifically in this area, if you go back through all the explosions of violence which superficially look like they're religious or ethnic in nature, each one of them is about an attempt to tinker with the patronage system that is how Nigeria runs. It runs from an enormous pot of oil money in the middle, funded by the biggest energy industry in Africa, one of the biggest in the world, and a patronage system that dribbles that money down through 1,000 capillaries into the political system. And it's how loyalty is secured through all the layers of the system. This one, and every sort of 2 or 3 years for the past about 20 years, there have been an explosion of violence like this, and each one you can tie back to some attempt at gerrymandering or some attempt to tweak that patronage system in favour of one group or other. And people who benefit most from it, in this case the local governor at the time, a guy called Jonah Jang, are prepared to weaponise that ethnicity and that religion for the purpose of maintaining control of that patronage system. And the reason I make this point at the start is to say that ultimately this is what we're trying to talk about, to my mind, in covering corruption in Africa. It's all well and good and valuable to find out that the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea has stolen so much money that he can afford to buy Michael Jackson's glove. and what have you, and that's important. But ultimately, what corruption does is it leaches, yes, money, wealth, but it leaches political power from the many to the few, and the wages of that are movements like this. And that life and death battle goes all the way up to the top. This is, do you remember him? He was the president of Nigeria until a month ago, Goodluck Jonathan. This is the day he won the primary in Nigeria. And he did that by his party bribing every one of these, I think it was 3,400 delegates, or certainly a vast majority of them, with $7,000 each to secure the result in advance. And it finally came out when that sun had gone down and come up again the following morning. So from Kurukarama all the way up through the political system, it's a game of buying political support. And I'll come in a moment to one particular thread of where this political power weaves into international corporate interests. But the thing to remember with these African corruption stories is that again and again and again, they're linked not to some kind of ancient ethnic rivalry, they're linked to the ultra-modern global commodity market. About half of sub-Saharan Africa's countries are classed as resource dependent. So the vast majority of their exports are natural resources, either oil and gas or diamonds or copper or cobalt or iron ore or other base metals. And similarly, the vast majority of government income in these places comes from exporting raw resources. That may seem a dry economic point, but it's crucial in several respects, but in one in particular, especially places like here. Goodluck Jonathan's government, and every Nigerian government for the past 20 or 30 years, and indeed the new one that's coming in with much fanfare now, its paymasters are not the Nigerian people, they are the foreign oil industry. 70% of Nigerian government income is from oil and gas, 4% direct taxation of the people. 70% to 4%. If you withdraw your consent in the UK, it sends a ripple through the system. If you're one of those grannies who refuses to pay council tax, there's a little tremor through the entire system because ultimately that's how it works, that we could withdraw our consent and refuse to fund the government and the government would not be able to function. If I'm in, this is in Abuja, if I'm in Abuja or in southern Nigeria or worse still in Boko Haram's territory in the northeast, and I withdraw my consent from the Nigerian government and decide to stop paying the taxes I already wasn't paying, of course it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. As a result of that, and this is the framework, I think, for how corruption really works in Africa, as a result of that, power resides not in the formal government, not really in the finance ministry and the central bank and the Ministry of Defence, all of which, of course, play roles, but in many cases, to a greater or lesser extent, in places like Angola and Congo and Equatorial Guinea, that's a facade. And what you have, and what we, for a few years, have been trying to map out, are these shadow states that exist behind that. President, generally a president, often a federal president, his immediate circle, members of his family, members of the top security elite nationally, then crucially a layer of middlemen, and then you have, in Nigeria's case, Shell, Exxon, and the other oil companies, the big mining companies elsewhere. And they're intimately plugged into the global economy, and it's that intersection that we're trying to track, because that's what ultimately connects these scenes to the oil in our cars and the coltan in our mobile phones, and practically everything in this room is made of something that's in great quantity in Africa, where about a third of all the world's natural resources are found. In about 2009, so shortly before that trip to Kurukarama, I started to hear this guy's name. Has anybody come across this man? He's pretty shadowy. He has at least 7 names that we know of, 3 passports, possibly many more. This is a French banker who's gone to work with him. He's best known as Sam Pa, but he's also called Zhu Jinghua and Su Qinghua and Chu Ka Lung and Sam King and Sampo Menezes and various other permutations. And Sam is the epitome, I would say, of these middlemen who, in the globalised economy, plug in Africa's kleptocracy to the commodity markets. we've been trying to put together a picture of Sam now. I first came across him in 2009, as I said. We've been trying to work out who this guy is and what his role is. And he's not the only one. There are several other middlemen, but he's one of the most remarkable ones of recent years. And it's been largely a case of combining, as you'll see in the next couple of pictures, hopefully, it's largely a case of combining what public records there are, corporate records in Hong Kong and Singapore, issued in Beijing, a handful that have come out in Africa, some in London, combining those public records with kind of shoe leather in Zimbabwe, in the diamond fields in Angola, in parts of Nigeria, in Guinea, Conakry especially. And then also, as with a lot of these big rolling stories that emerge in one way or another over several years, it's kind of collaborative with your competitors. I mean, it ends up that a handful of people have become obsessed with Sam. Some of them work in US research institutes, some of them work at Global Witness, some of them work at 100 Reporters out of Joburg. One of them files pieces for the Times. And it's one of those stories where everyone's so committed to trying to expose what's going on that you can jump over some of the sort of Fleet Street competitiveness that tends to stand in the way of that. So just to give you a little bit of sketch through the story of Sam and how we piece some of it together, as far as we've been able to work out, Sam, before he was this besooted businessman, this is a deal he did in Dubai, he was a spy. He was working either formally or informally with Chinese intelligence, with the civilian end of Chinese intelligence, initially at least, to cultivate relationships with the African liberation movements that were in the late 80s and early 90s, especially in southern Africa, about to take power or had already taken power. And alongside that, he was doing what a lot of the intelligence agencies were doing on the side, selling weapons to those liberation movements and possibly to the other side as well. Then Sam, with impeccable timing, is one of the people who's around and pretty well connected in 1999-2000 when China launches its big going out policy, and sends forth these state-owned companies into the world to try to find markets for exports, infrastructure contracts, and crucially the natural resources it needed for that huge economic expansion at home. And it needs people, Beijing needs people, and these companies needs people who know the territory, who know the remote bits of Africa where China's only had minimal relations for many years. Sam's in the right place at the right time, and this we have from a combination of intelligence sources and a court document that came out in 2013 in which two of his business partners fell out and helpfully recounted the whole, not the intelligence part, but the beginning of his business life to a Hong Kong judge who published his ruling. And Sam's first port of call is Angola. This is, ring any bells? This is Angola's kind of Mr. Oil, Manuel Vicente. He grew up kind of in the presidential family, and while all his comrades in the ruling party were going off to Baku and Moscow for training during the Cold War, proxy war that happened in Angola in the 70s and 80s and 90s, he went to Imperial College not far from here and trained in petroleum engineering, went back, and he turned Angola's state oil company into an ultra-efficient, impossibly opaque machine for generating oil revenue that could fund the government's campaign in the war against the rebels who were called UNITA. The MPLA, Vicente, the party that Vicente is a member of, and the ruling family around José Eduardo dos Santos realized pretty quickly that this machine they've built to fund the war, once the war's finished, the machine can be put to self-enrichment purposes pretty easily. And they still nominally have some kind of Marxist rhetoric about their policies, but ultimately they've become an immensely rich clique known as the Futungu, which is the in the name of the old presidential palace. And Vicente is the man, Vicente is like the chief executive of this machine, if you like. He's not the president, but he's the man who operates it. And he meets Sam Parr in about 2003 or 4. This we know from Angolan sources. I covered an election there in Angola and then went back for some more reporting. And persuaded Vicente to give us an interview, which he does very rarely, but he wanted to set the record straight after we'd written a story about how he had a secret stake in an oil venture unrelated to Sam, a secret stake in an oil venture run by a Texan oil company backed by Goldman Sachs. It was one of those situations where we were pushing on one story, pushing and pushing and pushing. He felt obliged to give us an interview in which he said, yes, I did own the stakes, but I didn't know it. If I had known it, obviously that would have been outrageous, but someone else was taking care of that for me. And in the course of that interview, I was able to confirm a few of these nuggets of information about how Sam went into Angola in the first place. And we can get more into those details if anyone wants to, but suffice to say, Sam ended up forming a company that's called China Sonangol, which is a Hong Kong registered private company represented by Sam, is the majority shareholder, and minority shareholder is Sonangol, Angola State Oil Company, and the kind of the engine of that kleptocracy. A company that's responsible for a $32 billion hole in the Angolan public accounts, according to the IMF. And this company, China Sonangol, is the bedrock of this network that Sam has started to build internationally, and it's the model for what he does. It has stakes in about 12 offshore oil projects now. And when I say it's the model for what he does, it's the model for how a lot of these middlemen work. They approach often isolated, kleptocratic, oppressive governments in African resource states, and they say to you, we will give you a machine that allows you to bypass the formal state and plug your shadow state, plug your personal political interests into the global economy through all manner of offshore structures. So that's where Sam begins and starts to make a lot of money. One of the stakes that China Sonangol gives itself is in a thing called Greater Plutonio, which is under the Angolan seabed. And it's where Sam's network, growing rapidly, starts to plug itself in, not just to Chinese interests and African interests, but into Western ones. So the vast majority, certainly for many years, of the income that Sam's network was able to win was because BP was pumping 200,000 barrels of oil a day from this field, and its partners were Sam and Sonangol. And this is another point I wanted to make, and will come up. It comes up again and again. Often we look at African corruption, and it's very easy to fall into a very outdated stereotype that's you just see the continent as a kind of discrete block of a discrete kind of sink of corruption, and it serves some people's interest to portray it like that, as though these sort of Snow White executives from Houston or The Hague or Beijing turned up and were trying to do business in a clean way and are seduced by grasping powerful African men and women, which is nonsense. A great many of the corruption settlements that have come out in the US under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act have shown deliberate and very willing corrupt practices by some of the biggest American and European companies. So we know of Kellogg Brown and Root, which is a subsidiary of Halliburton when Dick Cheney was running it. We know of Shell bribing the Nigerian customs service. We know of Siemens out of Germany running basically a global corruption system. Often corruption originates in the West, and often the networks that run that plug these corrupt, these sort of kleptocratic governments into the global economy snake right around the world. And I think it's helpful to think these days, and certainly in the last 15 years, it's very helpful to think of these networks not as particularly belonging to any state. So in this case, we're talking about Manuel Vicente, a man educated in London, his boss, José Eduardo dos Santos, a man trained possibly by the KGB in Baku. We're talking about Sam Parr, who has several passports and comes out of, grew up in either mainland China or Hong Kong. And then we're talking about business deals which these guys structure, which link them into BP, to Glencore in Guinea. And these are the kind of transnational networks that you see in something like Misha Glenny's book Mafia. They are, yes, they need to hold political power in particular countries, and they need to secure territory with resources, but ultimately they are effectively offshore. Just to give you a couple more examples, Sam, from his Angolan base, moves into Zimbabwe and strikes a deal, as best we know, to exchange about $100 million in payment to Robert Mugabe's secret police, the Central Intelligence Organization, totally terrifying organization. Exchange about $100 million for rights to mine, to trade diamonds from the Merengue fields, which are, it's a brutalized corner of southeastern Zimbabwe near the Mozambican border. And again, it's another part of Sam's network that's emerged through work by 100 Reporters and Global Witness. Then I went down there when I was working on the book and went to Merengue, and also went running up and down a building in the middle of Zimbabwe, trying again to combine kind of the corporate record stuff and the on-the-ground things, which is where you ultimately get the confidence to write this stuff, I think. It's a useful example, I think, in this particular case. So Sam's business partner, a woman, Lo Fung Hung, turns up on a corporate record in Singapore for a company called Sino-Zim. There's a couple of other directors, and one of them is called a man called Masimba Ignatius Kamba. And he gives, we didn't know who he was, Global Witness were the first people to publicly look into who this guy was. On that corporate filing, Kamba gives his address as, I think it's the 7th floor of Chester House in Harare, which is kind of run down, I think, 60s building where the lift doesn't work. And they have one of those, a paper visitors book, so everyone has to sign in their name. And I went there because Global Witness and others had reported that, to the best of their knowledge, Kamba is a member of the Central Intelligence Organization. So there was potentially a paper trail connecting Sam, who connects back, obviously, to Glencore, to BP, and to the big Chinese interests, connecting him directly to Mugabe's secret police, the people who've kept him in power in the repressive phase of his rule. So the lift wasn't working, you had to go up to the 7th floor, and on the 7th floor it just says Zell Gold, registered moneylender. But I carried on to the 10th floor, and on the 10th floor is the Zimbabwean Congress of Trade Unions, who have been a thorn in the side of Mugabe for a long time, and Morgan Tsvangirai, who's his main challenger, now pretty much defeated, but for many years was the main rival to Mugabe, used to be the head of the ZCTU. And I wandered in and started talking to these unionists, and I said, well, do you know anything about this mysterious guy, Kamba, who works on the 7th floor, who's in this business network that goes via Angola and via this guy, Sampar? And they said, oh, yeah, that's our CIO office. So they're the ones who are assigned to keep an eye on who's coming up and down the stairs to meet the unionists. All around the unionists, the trade union office, are pictures of their comrades who've been beaten black and blue and sometimes to death by the CIO and by Mugabe's thugs. So there it was. For me, that was as clear confirmation as you could have, combined with the corporate records, what the unionists believed, and then I did wander back down and go into this Zell Gold money lending on the 7th floor, Kamba's address, and it was just pretty much an empty room, a desk, 2 men, one sitting, one standing. The sitting one was screaming down a phone, and the other guy jumped pretty much out of his suit when a white guy walked in. I don't think they were used to that, and asked after Kamba. And this man was helpfully able to give me directions across town to another office where the secretary said, oh yes, Sampar has been coming and going, but he'll be back in a few weeks. So we missed Sam, but we were able to piece together another part of this network. The most obvious and straightforward thing, and I think often we overlook the value of public records, right? Is just PACER in the US, the registry of all court documents. It's absurd that in the UK you have to get the equivalent documents, you have to go to the High Court, find some building, up some staircase, and say, could I have the particulars of claim in this particular case? And someone will say, well, maybe in a year, possibly, if you call this number. And in the US, it's all there. So and it's on the DOJ website, a lot of this stuff. So because in the corruption cases in the US, they tend to do plea bargains, the company will have to agree to an information, so agree to a plea deal that involves the Department of Justice publishing the entire account. So in some of the older cases, the KBR one, the Halliburton one, it's an incredible read. They have the naira was so weak at that point when they were paying these bribes in Nigeria that you had to convert it into a carload of cash, convert a dollar bribe, and just leave the car, hand over the keys, park it in the Hilton car park in Abuja. So those are the ones for the cases that have already come out. The most useful things. So the case I was sort of mentioning earlier about the Goldman Sachs backed oil company, which is called Cobalt International Energy. That's one that we were able to break a bit of, and an amazing Angolan investigator called Rafael Marques de Moraes did a ton of work on. The best resources for that, the best public resources for that are just the 10K, so just the annual and quarterly filings by the companies themselves, and just going through, and just nobody reads these 400-page things. I mean, why? They're basically unreadable, but the vast amounts of detail and information. Just to give you one example, like it's crucial. Any company that you have a suspicion is involved in an iffy deal. It's crucial every single time to read in full their warning section, so their litigation risk section. So Cobalt, for instance, kept it exactly the same for quarter after quarter after quarter, and then they shoved in one extra line saying we've now been notified of a formal investigation, and boom, that's the confirmation you'd be looking for. To know which companies to look for, to know which companies to look for, the trick is, I think, often is it's the minuscule local partner. It literally is the thing with the weird name. In Nigeria, amazingly, one of them is actually called Con Oil. I should say we haven't actually done anything on Con Oil, but it's one of the companies linked to the big oligarchs. So in Cobalt's case, there's an enormous red flag when a company announces a new African, or Central Asian for that matter, or parts of Latin America, resource deal. Typically, they'll have local partners, and a lot of certainly African governments. I don't know so much about Central Asia, but I think similar things happen there. A lot of these governments are pushing forward the idea that it's time to have a big transfer of skills and resources into the local indigenous oil and mining companies, which on paper is a very good idea, and in some cases does work. In Nigeria, there are now some very good and very well respected little oil juniors who are starting to take old blocks off Shell and what have you, and keep a lot more of the revenue locally. The problem is that it's also often used as a cover, right? So so it's a way for officials like the Angolan regime to insert themselves secretly into an enormous oil deal. So they are the very people who give out the rights, and they can just reward themselves by saying, well, you can have these rights provided you take this local partner, which is exactly what happened to Cobalt. And if there's a 5% or a 10% partner on an oil deal, and you've never heard of it before, and you Google it and it's not there, and you're able, especially if you're in the country, if you're able to go to its registered address and often see that it's like a shed or it's on a road that isn't there anymore, these are the huge warning lights. And from there, you just start following that thread. Is that kind of thing? Yes, hi, go ahead.
A quick question about the legacy companies like De Beers, Anglo American, etc.
Yeah.
Who had a huge percentage of continental resources in their own financial belt, if you will. Maybe you could describe how they function now with this much flashier nouveau riche corruption system.
Yeah, well, De Beers obviously used to be a cartel, right? So De Beers used to basically control the entire global diamond market in one way or another. De Beers has basically just lost an awful lot of power in one way or another. And what happened with De Beers was it is a remarkable story, really. Not one that's directly so much about corruption, but how very, very occasionally you get an African government that pushes back against this enormous corporate power. So the government of Botswana, where the two most valuable diamond mines in the world are, Zwaneng and another one, effectively forced De Beers to move its cutting and polishing factories to Gaborone from London, and to allow Botswana to buy half the company. So Botswana now owns pretty much half of De Beers. And the whole Oppenheimer empire that, of which De Beers and Anglo-American were a part, and further back, the whole Cecil Rhodes empire, has kind of fallen apart. Anglo Gold now is a shadow of itself. It's had very tough times, and it's been squeezed out by a lot of guys. And we'll occasionally meet De Beers staff and senior managers in places like Angola and Botswana, Namibia, the big diamond places, in South Africa, and they just feel enormously squeezed out by the new guys who just elbowed in. A lot of them Israelis, so a lot of them people like Lev Levayev, who's the guy who smashed the cartel. He's another serious African player on the mining side who does a lot of deals in countries run by very corrupt governments. And about who very little is known. I think he's got like a £30 million house in Hampstead. He funds settlements in the occupied territories, and has enormous presence in African diamonds. Did anybody recognise this? Yeah. Well, actually, most recently, it was used as as the outside of it was used as the Gotham City Stock Exchange in one of those Batman films. But it is, of course, it's the House of Morgan, right? So this is 23 Wall Street. Just here is the New York Stock Exchange, and here, in case it wasn't obvious, is a tourist information sign that says this is the financial crossroads of the world. This building was, for quite a while, owned by Lev Levayev, right? So the man who took on and beat De Beers, and he was pouring African diamond money into an asset right in the centre of Manhattan. Does anybody know who owns it now? It's Sam Parr's people. Through, and this is another crucial point, through a Delaware company, whose ownership is secret and can't be revealed by the corporate authorities there. China Sonangol owns this. So this is money generated by Sam with his alliances in Guinea, with Mugabe's people and all the rest of it, with his business connections with BP and Glencore, helping to turn those interests into revenue, pouring money right into the heart of the Western financial world. And crucially, and this is something that Cynthia Omoku, my colleague, is going to talk about lots more, crucially using these veils of secrecy that you get in the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands and Delaware and the City of London, which are without which you wouldn't be able to have these connections between these kleptocracies and big trophy assets in the West. Which is to go off on an enormous tangent from your question, but there we are. Any just one here, and then yeah.
In your book, you kind of make allegations about her.
You've read it?
Yeah, halfway through.
Brilliant.
I've only got one copy though.
Only got one copy?
Yeah.
Don't talk to me.
Yeah, you make like allegations about kind of an awful lot of powerful people like Benny Steinmetz, Glenn Gore. Obviously, a lot of that came from articles you've written. But what kind of level of legal pushback are you getting from people when you kind of
absolutely
write replies and stuff?
Yeah.
Because we often, I work for Greenpeace and we've just kind of expanded our investigations unit.
Yeah.
And we find a lot of the time that the reply that we're getting from companies is kind of quite ambiguous. So it's like, oh, there are inaccuracies in the story, which is a real fucker because they don't tell you which ones, obviously.
No.
So then you kind of out on a limb.
But then again, they're not trying to help.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I was just wondering how you negotiate.
Well, yeah, we had absolutely vast amounts of legal dealings. So with not so much with the Sam Parr story, that was obviously very legally sensitive, but certainly with Benny Steinmetz, and with the book. Yeah, I had to send out an awful lot of fact-checking letters and right-of-reply letters, and got quite a lot of legal kind of either direct threats or semi-threats and smears, and people just making up. One company claimed that I had enjoyed a week of kind of no expense spared, all expenses paid holiday in the Kruger National Park at the paid for by an African president who's to whom I was apparently sympathetic. A place I'd never been before, but this stuff was being thrown around, being sent in letters to like senior people at HarperCollins who published the book. So that, yeah, there were all manner of shenanigans, which is, I imagine it's the same for you. I found that stuff genuinely terrifying, more so than running around like the merengue fields or whatever, in a way, because you just don't. It's just so much hard to quantify the risk. For the book, I was locked in a room at HarperCollins for a day with a libel lawyer going through line after line after line, and eventually he was going through some detailed points, and he just broke off and said, he's quite a posh guy, he just broke off and said, "Tom, do you own a house?" I said, no, I don't. He went, "Good." I carried on with it. But on a more serious note, when they come back and say there are inaccuracies in this without telling you what they are, without responding to your specific questions, which I imagine you do, I mean, what I basically tried to take the text and turn it into detailed questions, so that you would never want to give someone like copy approval or anything like that, but you want to be as I always think you want to be as frank as you can without any danger of exposing your sources. So yeah, when they come back as they typically do with yes, there are inaccuracies. You're being led astray by people who are kind of our enemies or our competitors or what have you. I think if you're solid in your sourcing, unless someone comes out with a cast iron denial, which I think should give you pause, then in good faith, and if the story's in the public interest, and if your reporting's been, honest and thorough, then you just go ahead. You go ahead. You give them lots of room to say, "We don't want to say anything." But yeah, I don't know if others have thoughts on that. But I think the trick is just to try and do it all in good faith. Yeah. And if they choose to do otherwise, then there you go. And then the legal threats will come. But that's, especially in London, it's so standard for people to make a legal threat and hire Mishka Rea or Carter Ruck or whichever one it may be. That as of just a final thought on this, I think ultimately we get so deep into thinking with a kind of libel lens when we write that sometimes there are situations where people just completely lose sight of the fact that you're just trying to assess whether it's true or not. And ultimately that's the thing, right? Is this true? Is it written in such a way that reflects the strength or otherwise of the reporting? Is it done in good faith? Is it in the public interest? Have they had a right to reply? And then publish and be damned. I think we can wrap ourselves in knots, trying to see the libel risk rather than just the reporting process. If you have a good lawyer, that's crucial as well. The FT's got Nigel Hanson, the in-house counsel of the FT, is phenomenal, and the in-house counsel at HarperCollins as well. And you can, I think you just write it. You write it as strong as your reporting will permit, and then let the lawyers make their judgment. So
I wondered if you had any thoughts about the way a story can actually get weakened in the media over time, even through the extradition process. Because I'm looking at when Tesla was taken to, say he was the middleman in this case, he was taken over to Paris in 2003.
Can everyone hear this? Jeffrey Tesla was the middleman in this bribery racket, basically. He was extradited.
Eventually, 7 years later. So I actually get the most detail from looking at the Paris transcripts, and I find those most extraordinary. And so you've got this process over about a decade. I'll try and sort of get this. So what I've actually seen is a weakening of the story, even in the good area of the media. The recent Swiss Leaks part that came out, Tesla and his associates' accounts were found, provide a bit of extra detail. But it was a completely different emphasis from Paris. And what I've seen is a weakening of that story over time. The transcripts that were released of the Department of Justice indictment, not indictment, but the final summing up, are so almost sycophantic towards Tesla. They're at such odds with what happened in Paris.
Over time, it fizzles out.
People almost see it as not that relevant anymore. It's ancient history.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of problem for mapping how corruption actually works.
Well, but it's also an indicator of how rarely it comes out, right? I mean, and what an enormous lag is required. So it only ever really comes out if there's a whistleblower or if there's a transaction, right? So if company X that was doing all this funny stuff is bought by company Y, and company Y finally realizes, oh shit, we've bought something with all sorts of funny bits around it.
And one of the guys who was heavily involved, Gilbert Chagri, is building the biggest development in Nigeria, biggest development I think in sub-Saharan Africa currently. You know, he was going to be arrested by Nigeria's anti-corruption squad at one point, and now he's you know, like all the governors.
But this is it. I mean, this is the politics of it's anti-corruption police work everywhere, but especially in somewhere like Nigeria, it's so politicised. So James Ibori, who's in jail now for money laundering here, who used to be a governor in the Niger Delta, he was guilty or accused under one president. He was then like right in the inner circle under the next president, and then on the one after that, he was guilty again. Didn't change what he'd done. It's purely that the FCC, the anti-corruption body, was.
So do you think that the history is still relevant? I find it relevant, but
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do, yeah. But it's just, I agree that it's hard to. It can be hard to make the case to an editor that something that happened. So a lot of the cobalt stuff when we started writing about it was what we were writing about happened 4 years earlier. But that is often the problem with the corruption stuff, that it's ultimately old, right? It's 3 or 4 years old. But the trick I think with a lot of it is exactly as you're saying. You show where they are today, right, and how the people who, in a lot of cases, it's just the company that takes the fine. This is one of the big flaws with anti-corruption legislation. Yeah. So the executive and the middle managers who did the deal 5-10 years ago took their bonuses, cashed in their shares. Very occasionally, like Tesla, they get caught themselves. But ultimately, the people who pay the huge corruption fines are the current shareholders, who had, in many cases, absolutely nothing to do with what was going on in the first place. And there's very little deterrent for individual behaviour in that.
Yeah. During your investigations, how can you find reliable witnesses?
A witness, to someone who was involved.
Yeah, or sources, or on the local ground.
Do you mean how to find them? Mm-hmm. Well, this is one of the advantages of doing this stuff from a patch. So I think there's great advantages to doing like a posting in a place, then getting out when it's relentless, and then getting out and reflecting on what was there and what were the leads you didn't have time to follow. So somewhere like Nigeria, I just lived there. I mean, it's crucial to be really. It's not crucial, but for me, I find it the most useful way to get context was just live in a place and get completely immersed in it, and immersed in the music and the football and the nitty-gritty politics and all the rest of it. I mean, but then there are just more basic tactics. Like premium LinkedIn is invaluable, which you can get by just doing a quick training course with them. Former employees of these companies are often useful. There are people. How to describe them? There are an awful lot of people who work in the oil and mining industries who are convinced that their industries are ultimately the salvation of Africa, and that it's only through more efficient business practices in mining and oil and better government management of the revenues that Africa will. The poor parts of Africa will pull out poverty, and I think that's often the kind of even from interviewing someone like Vicente down to kind of lower level people who will go out for a quiet drink in Angola who are in the oil industry. Like nobody thinks they're the bad guy, right? So when I was covering this bit of it with him, so I went to Guinea shortly after. He was a coup leader. He's Moussa Dadis Camara. He ran a junta in Guinea for a year, and then his bodyguards shot him in the head, and but didn't kill him. It's quite an indictment of a bodyguard's aim. And he's now in Burkina Faso and what have you. But he did a deal with Sam as well, and he brought back a UBS banker called Mahmoud Thiam to run the mining industry. Guinea has like most of the bauxite in the world, if not most, and the biggest resource. bauxite, the stuff you make aluminium from, and huge iron ore reserves. That's another whole story we've been trying to do. And this banker, Cham, I would have to talk to, just as the FT reports, I have to ring him up and say, so is this deal happening? Is that deal happening? And he was very frank, and I've interviewed him for the book several times on the record, and he's someone who would be regarded by many as a villain, right? I mean, he's the money man for this appalling junta that massacred 150 people in the National Stadium. He's been accused and denies of benefiting personally from cutting himself in on these deals, basically. But you talk to other people who knew him, and they said, no, this guy genuinely had a plan to try to reform the Ghanaian mining industry. So people are subtle, is my point, and very few people will give up a chance to tell their side of things, even if they are right in the thick of a deeply corrupt regime like his. Is that sort of what you were saying, or we're sort of more specific? And you always go through people's bins. No, you obviously can't go through people's bins, but someone apparently went through Mahmoud Cham's bins in New York. Yeah, and just the usual. I mean, and then the usual kind of online techniques, Facebook stuff, and LinkedIn, what have you. I don't know if you find. I don't know if when everyone thinks about this, but the extent to which sourcing, sort of source recruitment, if you like, or the first contact with sources has become much harder since Edward Snowden. Just because of everybody's so much more aware, as quite rightly, of cybersecurity, and so nobody wants to make contact electronically, which is probably for the best, but actually means you need much bigger infrastructure of encryption and safe laptops and what have you to even begin to talk to people. I don't know if that's something other people are coming across, but I think there's more things about that today. Any more questions? We've got another few minutes, I think. Yeah.
How do you find reporting on corruption as it sort of happens? Because frequently it's so ingrained in the system, and some of it is quite sophisticated that you can't really sort of make a story unless you've got the benefit of court documents or some information that comes out of a dispute. But that's usually a luxury, and that also comes 2-3 years afterwards. So how do you find reporting as it happens? Because it just, I would imagine it's quite difficult to sell a story to an editor, because what is the story? What is the allegation? What's the evidence? There's just not enough evidence.
What we're talking about is the abuse of public office for private gain. So anything that demonstrably fits that pattern is fair game, I think. So it depends where you and your editors are on the spectrum of how much leeway there should be in that. So someone like Dino, who's by his own account a former official in Angola in the presidency, now a very big businessman, I agree. He would say, as you did, that he's got out of public office. He's free to do business like anybody else. It's just like the revolving doors here, where former ministers go and sit on the boards of private companies. I think something like the Cobalt case is much clearer, raises much clearer questions, simply because the people who were privately benefiting from it were directly in charge of issuing the rights, right? So they issued the oil rights in which they themselves privately from which they were going to benefit. To draw the connection between corruption and political power. So to draw the connection between, in Angola, you have this web of private business interests, some run directly by the main generals and Dos Santos' allies, some run by Sonangol, effectively, that reach into every part of the economy. Diamonds is a big one, obviously, but all manner of importing, and of course oil. And I think that the thing is to draw the connection between that economic control and the political control. So it's that extreme level of private commercial control by the ruling clique that gives them the kind of the ballast, the insulation, to go and beat up 10 young rappers when they meet to talk about politics, or to go and arrest those guys who got arrested last week. It's to draw the connection between the illicit commercial power and repressive political power, I think is the crucial thing. It's the way that these corrupt structures, you track them. Yes, it's very hard, and yes, you have to stay on a particular story for years. But ultimately, and interestingly, when the people who do get caught, they all say, yeah, but everybody's doing it. They're all furious, not often because they've been caught, but because everyone else hasn't been caught too. To make that thread, and that's the thing I was trying to do in the book, is to draw that connection between commercial corruption and the concentration of political power, which is ultimately the worst. That's why I started with Joss. That's the real ultimate problem. The ones that are difficult to do fast are the ones that involve, as you say, the big foreign companies, because increasingly as well they've realised that. So Cobalt's never been convicted of anything or charged with anything, but it's obviously had a lot of trouble so far, and it's still under investigation. And a lot of the big oil companies certainly they want to do signature bonuses these days. So they want to pay like $2 billion up front. I mean, they generally don't declare the amount, but it often dribbles out, and you just put that in the treasury for someone else to steal it later. But it avoids the problem of having like a direct link to a private company owned by an official. So corruption is constantly evolving in these ways in response to the last big scandal. So that after Halliburton, which was a lot of cash moving around, there's been a trend of taking using front companies instead. So using a shareholding to reward an official instead of shifting cash. And no doubt it will now evolve in another way. But yeah, it can be done, but it's quite hard to do from outside the country, to be honest. And often the daily ones inside the country, it's trying to find that scandal that illuminates the extent to which political power is used overwhelmingly for personal gain.
What's the point of Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index?
I think it does serve a purpose to a very limited extent.
You said earlier that a lot of corruption originates in the West, so it's not reflected in perceptions.
Yeah, obviously it's based on
perceptions.
perception.
Impression of the way corporations work in the US and in Britain.
Yeah, I think that's true, but at the same time, it is useful to have an indication of the extent to which to me, that index is a guide to the places where corruption has become institutionalized, as opposed to the places where corruption remains a scandal, which is the only division really between a country that works and a country that doesn't. But I agree that often people massively overinterpret it and think that it's demonstrating that the behaviour of companies from particular countries is better than those from others.
Would you not say that it's institutionalised in the oil and gas companies?
Some are better than others, but yeah, I would. And I'd also say that the problem is that we keep discussing it in terms of states. The TI index it has its uses, but we're not talking about these things anymore. We're talking about these sort of transnational business and political networks. Like it's a combination of kind of Davos and Victor Boot. I mean, it's this kind of floating, these floating worlds of connections that don't really align to national interests in any way. And like someone like Sam, we for a while we were able to get some plane spotting site that could follow his private jet that he uses, and he's in every few months he's in the Maldives and Harare and Luanda and Hong Kong and Beijing, and these are international people, and their interlocutors on the African side are international too. I mean, they hold a political office in Angola, but their kids go to Harrow, and if they get sick, they go to Saudi Arabia for treatment. Sometimes UNESCO gives them a job, and their money's in Florida. I mean, it adds another layer of difficulty and complications to the reporting. But I think that's how corruption works now. It's these networks that are detached from nations. So the TI index obviously wouldn't cover that, I fear. Well, thanks very much, all.